carousel of sort of flowing MTDs around the houses from agent to agent to agent, when a lot of the time most of it is actually quite static. You know, so for example, if the only thing that's driving it is a change of agent in the old world, it's actually the same information just being sent around to multiple participants. If it is largely stable and it's visible at any point in time, that allows anyone who needs to know it to have access to it. Sorry, Kevin, were you going to add anything to that?
No, I think you covered it off quite eloquently.
Perfect. So we've got a few here we can group together on non-commissioned meters. So if there is a commissioned meter which turns into non-coms, would the industry treat it once it becomes non-coms for any process? Will it be traditional or smart?
So traditional and smart reside in the same segment, so that sort of makes it easier to a degree. But I think there's a design principle that basically says once if it's a non-commissioned smart meter, or once it's been established that there would be an extended period of non-coms, then yes, that meter would be treated as a trad meter. Or treated as if it was a trad meter.
And so follow-up to that would be, where commissioned smart meters have no comms, are the mandatory data items for commissioned SMs still mandatory?
Yeah, well, yes, I think is the answer to that. But if people have got any examples where that might be an issue, then if they could feed those back in the comments, and we'd consider whether we need to vary the conditionality on those fields.
And so then to follow up again with a non-commissioned question, if there is a non-commissioned meter which is later commissioned, how would the industry treat aftercoms for any process? Will it be trad or smart?
It would be smart once comms had been established. I mean, really, I suppose it's not. I mean, the meters are not really being treated that differently from a settlement, from a data and a settlement perspective, either way. But yes, once they've been commissioned at DCC, then the expectation is that the data service will begin dialing in and recovering the data, and yes, they would then be treated as a smart meter.
Okay, so this question might be overlapping with that slightly then, but can you please confirm how the following will be treated for flows? So number 1, AMRs, number 2, smart non-commissioned, and number 3, smart commissioned but non-coms.
So commissioned non-coms, I think, would be treated like any other smart meter, and the supplier and the the supplier and the data service between them would need to decide what, if any, mitigating action was required in order to keep accurate settlements on those sites. So if I had a commission meter that I knew was going to be non-coms for an extended period of time, I might agree with my data service to go and read it once a quarter, for example. If a smart meter was non-commissioned, then it would be treated like a trad, would be treated like a traditional meter. And then AMR, in terms of advanced meters, again, there's no real distinction between. I think in the advanced segment, meter technical details are always exchanged using the 268, and again, I think it would be between the supplier and his advanced data service and if there was an issue with comms, to put in mitigation depending on the size of the site and how accurate he wanted his settlements position to be. I don't know, Matt, Kev, have you got anything to add on that? I don't.
I mean, I think the only thing is, because obviously we have discussed this sort of internally a bit. I think again on the sort of smart no comms thing, I think there's obviously a set of rules that do drive off in terms of all the sort of the mappings and things and the meter type is obviously a key pillar in the mapping of things to segments. As Sean said, the smart non-smart distinction is less critical because that's not a segment boundary. But I do think there's something to be said for the meter type still representing the capability of that meter that's there, not misrepresenting it. So if there's capability that's sort of latent capability that's not being used, I still think that, there's an argument for differentiating that from something that is a flat out legacy trad meter. But obviously these should still be edge cases. I think, when the happy path should still be that most of the, like with AMR meters, or majority of smart meters should pass their commissioning, and then you can do all your other associations. You can link it to the device ID and everything works. And similarly, most of the existing non-half hourly settled AMR meters should be able to complete that journey to then being used as half hourly settled advanced meters. There will obviously be some fallout, and I think Sean touched on it before, that the only thing we just need to be account for there is make sure that if there's rules there that may need conditional relaxation or something for those cases, we can try and drill down and see what those are. But for the most part, I think that the intention is for the meters to be managed in accordance with the type that they are, and that is a fairly straightforward mapping table of saying this type of meter should end up in this segment. I mean, I guess one thing would be useful is to understand how, we're sort of making some projections on how large those pots may be. So, for example, non-commissioned smart meters, is that a temporary status that eventually gets corrected, or do they sit, for a long time on that status? But yeah, I think it really just comes down to when we sort of look at rules in terms of mandatory items and things like that, just making sure there's a bit of wiggle room in there for those edge cases. But I mean, they should be exceptions. They shouldn't be that commonplace.
Yeah, I'd just like to add for that is obviously there's a difference between smart and advanced in terms of if non-comms, if it's smart non-comms, you've got to fix the comms to retrieve the data. If it's advanced non-comms, you can always download the data with a site visit and a handheld device.
Yes.
So got a couple of questions still on the same theme. Will commissioned smart meters with no comms being treated as traditional meters require the data items that are mandatory for traditional meters? So, for example, the IF1 and 2.
I don't think any of I don't think any of the data. I don't think there should be any conflict in the data items and the conditionality. But if people feel that there is, then I ask them to highlight that in their comments response. But I don't think there is any. I don't think there would be any conflict in the conditionality. Because
And I mean, trad meters obviously still, that's where the whole sort of 149.150 route comes in. That's on the basis that because they're sort of the configuration has to be done by the metering service. They're the only ones who can do it on site. Obviously, smart meters, when working properly, the suppliers configure them, and that's why the meter information and registration is about the asset, because it doesn't have to contain all of the configuration information because the supplier is setting that. So I guess if a smart meter cannot be commissioned properly and there's not communication, then there isn't the means to configure it.
Yeah,
so it's going to be non-functioning whichever way.
And to the point earlier on, if it was going to be non-commissioned or non-communicating for an extended period of time, then the supplier and his data service working together would say, well, okay, perhaps I need to go and get a cumulative read off that meter, once a quarter.
Yeah.
And just one final question on this topic, then I think we're okay to move on. Is there a way for a smart meter commissioning state or non-comms? Sorry, the question's just jumped. I'll start again. Is there a way for a smart meter commissioning state or non-comms to be communicated out to the industry so that services like Reg Service and MS are aware?
I don't think that exists at the moment. Again, I think I would feedback in the comments, but I think I don't know. Do suppliers not get an indication of that from DCC when they're commissioning them or sort of attempting to configure the meter? I don't think our design accommodates that, but I'm not familiar enough with the low level detail that suppliers get from the DCC when they attempt to, when they take a meter on. Perhaps it sounds like it would be a data item better housed there, but I would feed it back in the comments and we would look at it.
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, maybe it warrants its own type or something, so that it it's clearly distinguishable from an old non-Fowling meter or a functioning Smiths meter. I mean, the other part that's got me thinking, which I think maybe we need to just, is part of the, when that asset is installed, obviously one of them, when the metering service is updating that information, there is that association that has to be created between the the DCC inventory and it's the way that it knows the meter and the way the physical asset is. If something breaks down in that process, then obviously you've lost that association. If you have that association, even if it isn't functioning, at least you have the means to be able to resolve it. So yeah, I think say if there's a way of maybe trying to signpost those via their own type or something, at least something the metering service can action themselves without being dependent on other people, that might be a way forward. But it's certainly something we would encourage. If people think that this is a material thing that there's going to be a significant number of, I definitely would encourage that to be, to draw attention to that.
Okay, so I'll go back up to top now and take the sort of most rated comments. So the next one is interface 2. There's data that is mandatory. This necessitates that a meter must be installed for the flow to be issued. How would you work for the COS number meter process?
I think that's supposed to say COS no
COS
meter.
or no
Catherine.
meter, yeah, the COS no meter. So
I think there's two different. So yeah, I think we'd. I think there was a. So there's an event type for new connections where metering might not be present. I suppose yes, we perhaps we need to revisit if there are anything that's showing as mandatory. We probably need to just revisit the conditionality on that. So again, if there are any data items that cause a concern in that scenario, I'd feed that back in the comments. But I'll take a note to go and relook at interface 2 and all those interfaces 2 and 36 to check that we're not saying something's mandatory when there might be a no meter. There might be a site with no meter going through a COS. So I'll take an action to look at that anyway. But if people could feed back in the comments, that'd be helpful as well.
I mean, Sean, I think we should call out that we've also looked at in terms of the segment allocation as well, that we need to have some defaulting kind of rules in there so that things with no meters on them can also be assigned a segment, even if it's only on a transitory basis. So yeah, we are trying to account for no meter type scenarios throughout.
Gotcha. And the next top rated question was, please can you confirm what data we will receive for smart and traditional meters? Will it be half hourly data and cumulative reads for smart and just register reading for traditional?
So it depends on the context of who and what and when. So if we deal with the traditional meters to begin with, effectively the data service through the sort of meter data retrieval element of the data service will still be going out and reading those meters. So the data service would read the meter and then send that data or would use that data for settlements and then send the meter readings onto the supplier on a D10. When it comes to smart data, I think the expectation is that the suppliers will be connecting to smart meter and downloading whatever data they require for their billing and for their billing purposes, or energy management information to the customer. And similarly, the data service through the MDR will also be downloading that half hourly data. So in an ideal world, there would need to be no exchange of data there. However, I think this is where we get into the sort of complication around there's sort of different models that could be deployed, different organizational models that could be deployed around how suppliers either implement an SDS service themselves within house, or whether they contract or contract separately for one. So in those scenarios, I guess you could have slightly different flows of data. So I think the questioner would need to be sort of more specific on the parties and the circumstance. But I don't know whether that's helped at all.
I think the other thing, Sean, is also that, like, yeah, on smart meters, it's also just recognizing the reality that the supplier is the one who has that access to the tariff registers, and then they have the ability to configure those tariff registers. Settlement processes have been designed to function independently of that. So in terms of being, if there's anything that requires an actual, a reading at the site from the display of the meter, all this kind of, the cumulative is sufficient for that to work. So yeah, I think as Sean said, most of the settlement data should be happily ticking away with half-hourly data, but then the fallback process where you need a register read, a cumulative is sufficient to do everything else that you need. So an SDS only has to deal with cumulative readings for their purposes. On the supply side, as Sean said, then it may be that a supply implements something in a way that they try and piggyback on those and think, oh, well, I'll try and harvest everything at the same time, or try and branch my processes differently. But yeah, for the settlement arm of those processes can function perfectly well for smart, just with cumulative register readings.
Okay, so the next one is, will new MDD role codes be created for the new MHHS metering services to differentiate with old MO role and allow for efficient routing of DTN messages?
So I think this is something that's still subject to a final decision. I think what we can say is that within the bubble of the DIP, if you like, there will be new participant codes, a DIP ID, and there'll be a DIP role. I think there's several different approaches as to how that might be reflected back into the DTN world, and those are still, those are still under sort of active discussion and consideration. But what will be required is a definitive mapping between a DIP pair, if you like, a DIP identifier and a DIP role, and some combination of a DTN participant ID and role code. I think there are, like I say, there are a couple of different approaches that we could envisage in terms of how that's realised on the DTN side, and we're still having discussions with participants and discussions internally about that. I think what we do recognise is that different participants may choose to implement this in a different way, depending on what their current roles are and the number of MPIDs that they're currently managing. So I think, like I say, the sort of short answer is that a definitive decision still to be taken, but in order to make it all work, there will need to be a definitive mapping between DIP ID and role combinations and the equivalent in the DTN, albeit not finally decided on what those are yet.
Okay, so I'll go back to one of the questions that was asked about half an hour ago now. So discrepancies between data items in terms of conditions, data type, etc. in IF and data categorization, PHIS, including meter details. Will the program reconcile documents to remove these? Shall I read that one again? It was quite a complicated one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Discrepancies between data items in terms of conditions, data type, etc. in IF and data cat, PHIS, including meter details. Will the program reconcile documents to remove these?
Yes, they should be. They should be consistent, and if they're not, that's an error for which we apologise. So again, I would urge people, if they spot these things, to feed them back in the comments review process. What I would say is that that is an activity that we have done ourselves internally, but obviously, interfaces, lots of different assets. So I would, you know, I wouldn't be surprised if we had odd things that didn't line up. So yeah, please feed those back in as part of the comments review process.
Gotcha. Okay, so there's a few questions here about specific data flows. So in the D-flow interface mapping, there are some flows that say partially replaced. What does this mean? For example, the D149-150 partially replaced by IF 6 and 7.
I think partially replaced is saying that in some circumstances I won't need a 149-150 at all. So in the case of smart, I've no need to exchange a 149-150, and the whole process is genuinely replaced by interface 5 and 6. In the case of traditional, then I need to use interface 5 and 6 to update the core asset information in registration. But as we've said, we still need to exchange, you know, register mapping information. So that would continue via the 149-150. Obviously, in the dim and distant future, when all trad meters are smart meters, then, you know, the need for the 149-150 would slip away. But that's why both exist.
Got you. And on to another flow then. So D170 has been removed as requests for MTD D215 triggered by events. D215 can be requested anytime with no trigger event. How will this be managed without the D170?
Yeah, this is one I got on session on Friday as well. I think that's something we'll probably have to take away. I mean, I think the assumption is all of those trigger events, they are points that then send out their data. I guess it's trying to identify the situations where someone needs to ask for something because there isn't yet.
Yeah, I think
the point at which they need it it's not available at that point.
What I'd also say is that we're planning on implementing a MPAN inquiry service as well. So again, there's still some ongoing discussion around how exactly the mechanics of exactly how this will work, but it's most likely that EES, or ECOs as people might know it previously, will be made effectively, will be updated in real time. And then so participants will be able to leverage the existing and possibly new APIs to effectively get a virtually real-time view of what's in the registration system by querying EES. So again, you wouldn't need to request someone to send you a flow. You could just use the query service to interrogate the data directly.
Yeah, I mean, I think the concern on Friday seemed to be to do with the old world. Obviously, I think it was 268 someone mentioned, or 149, the old world DTN flows. So if there's additional information there that isn't held centrally, but I think it's certainly to understand the examples of when it is that people need to ask for stuff. Why hasn't one of those natural process triggers flowed that information on? I think that would be useful to understand, because then you can always try and amend that by having the relevant trigger. I think that too many times in the current arrangement, someone has to ask for something because it hasn't reached them through the proper means. If we can close all of those, then there's less need to kind of speculatively have to send 170s to retrieve stuff.
Good stuff. Right, we are down to the last 5. So let's go back to one that was asked at 128. How is the MS agent expected to carry out a half-hourly download for an advanced site? Currently, any consumption for the period between 0 hours and MEX is estimated.
I think that would still continue to be the case. I know there's been there were a lot of discussion in the working groups around how do you maximize the recovery of half-hourly data in these kind of, in this particular circumstance. And I think to be honest, I think we're in a situation where we're saying that the processes that exist today would largely continue. However, if a particular supplier wanted to come to special arrangements with his meter service and his metering service and data service to perhaps have some mechanism of being able to, poll the meter, while the metering service bloke was sat there ready with his screwdriver, then that's sort of up to us. It's up to a supplier to put those arrangements in place. But yeah, I think otherwise, you'll just be downloading the data as you do at the moment. I don't know. Do you want to add anything more to that, Matt?
No, I think that's spot on. It's just all we're trying to do is, you're just trying to maximize the data that you can retrieve through the steps that you can take. If you can only get what you can get, and as I said, most of those existing processes accept the reality of things. I think there are some approaches, as Sean said, where some people have been able to try and do. I think it's also to do with how predictable some of that stuff is in terms of if something's going to happen, and the job to remove the meters, if it's all planned and far enough ahead, that might allow for some kind of convenient retrieval of information just in time. But a lot of the stuff is unpredictable. If that is the case, then estimation is sufficient. We're not trying to impose. I think that's correct, Sean. We're not trying to impose additional requirements in that respect.
No, absolutely.
It's just trying to maximize the actual half hourly data that just always try and get as much as you can.
Exactly, yeah, and we're saying if there's nothing to prevent suppliers putting those arrangements in place, like I say, whether perhaps the metering service phones up and says, "Oh right, I'm about to take the meter off the wall. Can you poll it for the last drop of data?" If suppliers want to put that mechanism in place, that's entirely up to them. Otherwise, it's a best endeavours to recover as much information as possible before the meter's removed, and BAU download back to, I think you were saying, midnight will be perfectly fine. Obviously,
I think Sean, we also recognise that many of these meter exchanges might be because the meter was faulty in the first place, and therefore even recovering the data would be futile.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, is the plan in the future, once the DTN is replaced completely by the DIP, to replace the source of all MTD, smart and non-smart, to be the reg server?
That's
effectively where you'd get. That's effectively, well, I mean, we're sort of there already, other than the modes of communication. So yeah, but that's the DTN will be around for at least the short to medium term. So, but yes, there will come a point where decisions will have to be made to say, well, okay, have we reached a point of smart saturation that we don't need, that we can mitigate the use of these flows now, or do we need to recreate for the small minority that are left something equivalent on the DIP?
Yeah, I was just going to say, Sean, exactly as you said, it's more like the trad meter smart rollout should eventually run most of those off. I think it's the advanced segment that opens that question. It's whether advanced MTDs on an enduring basis might move to a different solution, but I think that's still a few years off, I think.
Okay.
But obviously, there's obviously security type, there's passwords and there's things in that information that maybe are not well suited to being held centrally.
And the next one, top rated with 5 likes, is how will the DNO emergency job info, like MEX, be sent out to the industry? There's no process in BP9 for this. Comment mentions BAU, but that's only for trad.
Well, if it's only, I suppose if it's only, I think you'd use the same mechanism for trad and the smart. Perhaps we just haven't got into a position yet where smart meters still relatively new. There's not a need for DNOs to do emergency replacements on them. But I think what we're saying is that the DNO would effectively pass the information to the metering service. So the DNO would have an obligation when he's, if he's gone out to site and done something to a meter, then he has an obligation to tell the metering service what's gone on.
Got you. Down to the last 3. So next one is, can metering services qualify to only certain connection types, such as whole current only? This will reduce qualification effort and facilitate auto rejection.
So my understanding is that has been discussed with the RecCo, and that is not currently how qualification is planned to work. But I think we would probably need to double. I think that is still subject to some discussion. But my understanding is that qualification would happen at the there wouldn't be this sort of sub element of sort of voltage or connection type to it. But I think that's probably something. I believe those conversations are still ongoing with RecCo because they have some interest in this, and I believe that's the kind of agreed position. But I would need to double check on that.
Yeah, I'll just come in on that. Yeah, I think the agreed position is that certainly if you look at the advanced segment, we're not expecting metering services to qualify to different connection types. However, within the industry standing data, there is a mapping of those metering services identifiers to connection types. So that would sort of future-proof it if they do move down that route in the future.
Where and when will the rules or wiggle room for edge cases regarding non-coms be defined and agreed? For example, timescales for fixes, manual reads, etc.
I think they're sort of there, or I think they're sort of there already. In that, you know, if I've got a non-com site, then as a supplier, being mindful that the settlement period cut off is at 4 months, then I think I'd probably be wanting to look at reading that meter every quarter. Although having said that, if I thought it was a low risk, low usage site, and I might decide to take the hit on estimated settlements and only read the site every 6 months. So I think there's an element of supplier discretion and supplier risk management in there really, and the key date is that 4 month cut off for settlements. Is that that's the risk. That's the trade-off that I'm, as a supplier, that's the trade-off I'd be making. Is the risk around acquiring some significant over or under settlement versus how often I read the meter. So I think that's the only timescale that the formal timescale that suppliers need to be mindful of in that sort of scenario. Obviously, on a change of supplier, we do have there's some requirements to try and exchange reads, or at least agree estimates. But those are the only two. I think those are the only two scenarios where it's possibly an issue.
Okay, next one is, when will the market-wide half-hourly settlement performance assurance regime be developed and discussed?
What can Matt, Kev, are you more in the loop on this than me?
I know from the last conversation we had, because obviously that this is sort of largely for the codes with sort of a steer, I guess, with some input from the so the plan. I know the sort of the plan further downstream past design has a window in it for assurance framework development, but obviously most of that is then left to the codes to develop. So there's time allotted for it, but in terms of actually steering the work, this is sort of about how the codes work with their sort of their constituents, their parties, and their relevant PABs and everything else to kind of to distill out what it is that, in terms of looking where the risks are, where the potential failure points are. There's an element of discovery in that. That takes sort of a bit of time. So I know I've certainly seen some stuff from earlier phases of the half-hourly settlement SDR, where there is some thinking has already gone on in both codes, in both the BSD and REC, as to how this, sort of the stuff is going to be managed. But obviously part of that kind of virtuous circle is them understanding the design as things sort of evolved, and they can then start to drill down in terms of when they look at what data they might need access to and stuff. So some of this is iterative. But I think our current position is that there is space allowed in the plan to allow that work to continue. But I think it's something that we'd probably be it would be, and I think we've also got handshakes and sort of checkpoints between program and code managers to see how that stuff is moving forward. But it is largely being sort of left to the, with support from the program for the codes to develop those frameworks. We're not going to impose a risk management framework onto codes.
Just to add to that, hi, this is Anna Miller from Elexon Performance Assurance. That's something that we are discussing with the programme at the moment, and there will be communications out to participants once that's been agreed, because there are certain parts that are obviously hardwired into the code, such as the supply standards and supply charges, which we're going to need to try and address with the programme, I think. And then, as you said, there's going to be involvement from the performance assurance boards involved as well.
Thank you, Anna. Yes, there is some stuff like that. That's another point, is in the code drafting space. Obviously, if there's codified standards and things like that, which that conversation needs to happen in terms of understanding the approach to the drafting as well, so that, do those stay in there, or do they get updated or removed or whatever. So, but that's good to know that those conversations are happening, Anna.
Next one, I think, is more from my colleague Kevin in the PPC, but it's please confirm when the questions and answers for this session are going to be published and when.
Yeah, cheers, Pete. Well, look, to be honest, folks, we don't really have any firm date of when these go up. So there is a number of different questions and answers from previous design playbacks, which are on the website already. We're working through different batches as well. So in some of these sessions, we're getting probably on average 35, 40 questions, up to 70 in some cases as well. So it does take a bit of a while to triage the questions. While we do take notes in the meeting, we need to make sure that the answers are as valuable for everyone as possible. So I would say that batches 4, 5, and 6 should be published by the end of this week, and then we'll probably within the next week or so you'll see questions from this session come up.
Thanks, Kevin. And the last one we've got in for the moment is that there's a live change under the REC R26 to bring in the concept of WCCT certificates, which would effectively create a dual qualification process under MOCOP.
Yeah, so I think this relates back to the qualification question earlier on, and clearly things are afoot both within the MHHS side and in terms of development of the qualification criteria, and obviously the changes that are going through REC. So needless to say, we have a good working relationship with the REC guys, and there's regular contact between us. So we will coordinate the activity to make sure there's alignment, and that we don't end up with two bits of the industry taking opposite views. So when that REC comes to a conclusion, whatever it is, then that would need to be then the program would need to reflect on the implications of that and adjust accordingly. But like I say, we're in regular discussion with the REC around all this sort of stuff. So watch this space, I guess.
I mean, I don't just want to throw in, might be one that sort of Peter has some recollection of, but I know that when we're having some of the sort of initial engagement kind of discussions, actually there was an interesting kind of split between the sort of field aspect of meter operations, the sort of the actual people who go out and do the work, and then the kind of back office stuff. And I think sometimes, we tend to just look at the qualified role as being the sort of the whole thing. And I think a lot of this, certainly from an initial discussion I had with REC, it might be that actually this is all part of the same solution. It's all heading in the same direction, that maybe a lot of that accreditation actually happens at individual site, operative level, in terms of who can work on CTs and who doesn't. But then the back office side of, in terms of sending the messages and accepting the appointments and doing the DIP interactions, that may split a different way. So I think, as short answer, as Sean says, I think there's probably just a kind of composite integrated solution. I think these are all targeting different aspects of the same thing. So I think I'm fairly confident we'll come away with something on an enduring basis that works.
Thanks, Matt. So that's the final question we had in our Slido. I think we had about 40 in total there. If there are no more coming through Slido, do people want to just raise their hands and ask any verbal questions? can't see any at the moment.
I can't see any.
I can't see any note.
Okay, well, I'll leave it to you guys to wrap it up then. But I think that'll be.
I mean, again, I think hopefully that's been a valuable session for everyone. Certainly a couple of things for us to take on board and go away and have a double check on. I think there's a number of other other surgery sessions later this week. So I think the next one is I believe there's a technology one tomorrow, a settlements one on Thursday, both of those at 10 o'clock, and then myself and the gang are back on Friday at 10 o'clock for the registration one. So hopefully you're all aware of those sessions, and just say thanks again for all your input and for spending your lunchtime with us. So thanks a lot. I'll wrap it up there, I think. Cheers, everyone.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks a lot.
Thanks,
Right.
folks.
Cheers,
Thank you.
guys.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye for now.
you.